Hello and welcome. My name is Chris from ChristopherHole.com and welcome to episode 27 of our podcast. And our topic is obesity, who is to blame? We're going to split this podcast up a little bit. I'm going to quickly introduce it. I'm going to go through what I consider to be the three elements that have a portion of the blame within the obesity epidemic or the obesity that is in the world today. And then I'm going to quickly summarize at the end. Before I get into that, I would just like to quickly mention my social media, which is Facebook, Christopher Hole Training, and Twitter, @Christopher Hole. So please do come along there, like and follow. It'd be great to have you there. Alternatively, come to the website, christopherhole.com/workshops. It'd be great to have you along to one of the workshops. I can meet you face to face, and I can answer any of your questions more specifically and I guess more directly as well. So, with that in mind, coming back to today's podcast or podcast topic of obesity, who is to blame? Over the past few years, obesity and diabetes has been on the rise. Within the health industry, within the medical industry, there are certain factors that are now being put forward as considerable contributing factors towards the rise of obesity and diabetes, namely the food that we're eating and the movement that we're doing. So what we are looking at with regards to that is who are we trying to push the blame on? I know a lot of people are trying to push the blame on governments and the food industry and so on and so forth, but what we also have, which is what I'd consider to be the third element, is the individual. So those are the three elements that we are going to talk about. We're going to talk about the government, we're going to talk about the food industry, and then we're going to talk about the individual themselves. So if we start with the government, now the government is responsible for releasing the healthy eating guidelines for the country, and they will take that from sort of independent bodies, and they will put forward their healthy eating guidelines. And then that is what they release out to the people of the country, and then it is up then to the people to follow those guidelines as best they can and get the results as best they can. So that's kind of one role of the government. But the other role is they have a lot of voices to manage. Now, I talk about this in the workshops that I do a lot of if the questions come up, and money talks. So you've got big businesses who carry some weight because of the money that they have and the power that they have. So they are able then to influence what the government does. So then the government then are sort of caught in a catch-22. They've got to do the best for the country, not only from a health perspective, from a financial perspective, from a vocational perspective, whatever it might be, from an educational perspective, from a like a social services and public services perspective. So they've got a lot of voices that they're trying to manage with regards to the resources that they have. So what we have to understand now, again, this isn't condoning what the government do in whatever field that they are doing it in. I'm just saying this is what's happening. So they are trying to manage a lot of voices in their sphere of awareness, if you will. And what we as the individuals have to do is, first of all, we have to understand that, because when we understand that, we can then act accordingly in a different way, which is what I'll talk about next. So that's kind of number one. Number two is the food industry. Now, they're the ones that are providing the food for the people to buy. But a big goal of theirs is they want to sell products to make profits. So when it comes to marketing and advertising those products, they will do everything they can to maximize the products or maximize the sales that the products get, if you will. And the third thing that they're doing is they're watching buyers' behavior. So if the buyer is buying a lot of certain foods, then they're going to create more of it to create more profits for their shareholders or the business owner or whoever takes the profits, if you will. So they're watching buyers' behavior. So the government have a portion of the blame because they're the ones setting the guidelines, and they might not be setting them as effectively as they could because of other influences that they've got around them. The food industry as well, they are the ones providing the people with food. They might not be providing the best food that they can because they're trying to maximize the profits that they are trying to create for the company. And the other thing they're doing is they're watching the buyer's behavior and watching what the people are buying. Which brings me on to the third one, which is the individual, who are the ones that are buying the food. So I've always said is the buck stops with the individual. So I know individuals want to put the blame on the government and they want to put the blame on the food industry, and they do hold a degree of responsibility for the obesity epidemic. But what they hide behind is the eating in moderation and should be eaten as part of a healthy diet. So they hide behind that because there's a lot of grey area. But what the individual needs to be able to do is take responsibility for their actions and not buy those foods. Because for one, if the food industry notice that people are no longer buying certain foods, they'll stop creating it because there's no profit margin there. And they will start creating the foods that people are buying. So in the last 10 years, certainly 10 years, plant foods, vegan foods, vegetarian foods, they've been on the rise. You've started to see vegan restaurants, vegetarian cafes, and so on and so forth. They're all growing. Plant-based protein powders, so on and so forth. They're all starting to grow. So people are starting to buy other things. And guess what? Companies are starting to notice that. So they're starting to create those so they can maximize the profits. So there has been some headway built and some responsibility taken by the individual. But what we have to understand is that when it comes to obesity, it's the individual that's in control of the food that's being put in their mouth. They are in control of the emotions, they're in control of the amount of activity they're doing. So it comes down to them to buy the correct foods. Now they're buying the incorrect food for whatever reason, because it's sociable, because it's exciting, because they like the taste of it, whatever it might be. So they're doing that, but they have to understand that that's giving them a certain outcome, if you will. So with regards to the obesity epidemic, it's about getting the people to make better choices, which then comes down to empowering the individual. Now, I know there are some people that are too far down the line and they need other interventions than just changing what they're eating and doing a bit more activity. But for most people, that's the cornerstone of the intervention and the actions that they need to be taking. So who is to blame for the obesity epidemic? The government play their part, the food industry play their part, and the individual plays their part. So they're all in this together. They've all got to work together, but the buck always stops with the individual. Because one thing I've always said to the students that have always been in my workshops is I am yet on a McDonald's or whatever fast food restaurant, I am yet to see one of the employees or one of the business owners come out and physically drag someone in and make them buy that food and eat it. People are going in there of their own free will. Yes, you might consider them to be manipulated through advertising, or advertising is pushed in a certain way to influence people's buying habits, and that's fine. But it still comes back to that individual realizing that that's happening and then taking the steps to not allow that to happen for the sake of their health and for the sake of the obesity that they're experiencing. So it's very much, instead of just trying to put the blame on the government and say the government need to sort this out for me, it's very much, right, what can I do for myself? How can I help myself within all of this? And the same goes for the food industry. But the food industry are providing the food. Why can't they create other food? There are certain food companies that are providing other foods that you can start to eat. There are cheaper supermarkets now in the UK that are providing what would be considered health foods at a much cheaper price. So it's being able to understand that, but the key is wanting to eat those foods. And as I mentioned, the buck stops with the individual. So all three of them, do not get me wrong on this, all three of them play their part. The government play their part, the food industry plays their part, and the individual plays their part. But the buck always stops with the individual. And I am much more keen to empower the individual, help them to make the right choices, than try and influence the food industry or the government. Because if the individual starts buying different foods, the food industry will act and they will act according to their buying habits. So that's what I believe we have to focus on, is focusing on educating the individual, educating and empowering the individual to make better choices and help them understand their own behavior so they can make the changes that they want to make. So that's my episode 27, Obesity, Who is to Blame? Hopefully it's been useful. Hopefully you've gained a little bit from it. Again, if you do have questions, please leave comments below. It would be great to have them, and then I can answer them and possibly add a little bit more perspective to what I've shared. So many thanks for watching. My name is Chris from ChristopherHole.com. I'll speak to you in the next episode.